The crystal glasses clinked as champagne flowed freely around the elegantly decorated private dining room. Soft lighting cast a warm glow over polished silverware and pristine white tablecloths. In any other circumstance, it would have been the perfect backdrop for celebration. Instead, it became the stage for the most calculated moment of my life. As Jason's father stood to begin his toast, I felt the weight of the USB drive in my clutch, containing evidence that would transform not just my future, but everyone's perception of the man they had gathered to celebrate. Before we jump back tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emily Wilson, and until 4 months ago, I believed I was living a charmed life. At 32, I had built a respectable career as a financial analyst at Meridian Financial Group in Boston, specializing in risk assessment and compliance. My professional life was meticulous and orderly, every decision calculated, every risk evaluated. It's what made me exceptional at my job, and ironically, what would eventually save me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Jason Carter entered my world 3 years ago during a charity gala hosted by Boston's financial elite. Tall with confident shoulders and a smile that somehow managed to be both charming and serious, he commanded attention when he spoke about investment strategies and market opportunities. As the rising star at Pinnacle Investment Partners, Jason had built a reputation for delivering exceptional returns to high-net-worth clients through what he called strategic market positioning. Our connection was immediate, both professionally and personally. We shared the language of finance, the understanding of markets, and a drive that kept us both working late into evenings. Where I was careful and analytical, Jason was bold and intuitive. "This is why we're perfect together," he would say. "Your precision balances my vision." I found his confidence intoxicating, his ambition admirable. When he proposed 18 months into our relationship, I said yes without hesitation, my analytical mind for once taking a back seat to my heart. The wedding plans expanded quickly. Jason preferred everything grand, the exclusive Oceanside Gardens venue, a 10-day honeymoon. On Italy's Amalfi Coast, a guest list that included every important connection in Boston's financial community. "This isn't just a wedding," he explained, while reviewing estimates that made my budget-conscious mind whirl. "This is a statement about who we are and where we're going." I chose my bridesmaids carefully, my college roommate, my sister-in-law, and Olivia Reed. Olivia and I had met at Meridian when she joined the marketing department 2 years ago. We weren't particularly close, but she and Jason had clicked immediately at company events, sharing the same extroverted energy and appreciation for luxury. "She understands our world," Jason had said when I questioned if we should include someone I didn't know as well. "Plus, she has incredible connections we could leverage." The first sign that something wasn't right came during a routine check of our joint account. Jason and I had maintained separate finances except for one shared account we'd established for wedding expenses. I noticed several unexplained withdrawals, not extraordinarily large but consistent, always between $500 and $1,000, always on Thursday afternoons. When I mentioned them casually over dinner, Jason explained them away as vendor deposits for wedding arrangements. "I've been handling the smaller vendors, transportation, welcome bags for guests, some surprises for you," he said, reaching for my hand across the table. "I wanted to take some stress off your shoulders." It was thoughtful, it was considerate, it made perfect sense, except it didn't align with the vendor payment schedule I had meticulously prepared in my wedding planning spreadsheet. A week later, my credit card company flagged an unusual charge at the Westbrook Hotel downtown, a Thursday afternoon booking when Jason had told me he was meeting with clients. When I mentioned the fraud alert, his explanation came too quickly. "That was for my parents," he said, not looking up from his phone. "They were in town secretly to meet with the wedding planner about their contribution. I used your card by mistake. My wallet was in my other jacket. I'll transfer the money tomorrow. Small inconsistencies began accumulating like dust in corners. Inconsistencies I might never have noticed if not for my training in pattern recognition and risk assessment. A receipt for dinner for two at Renee's Bistro appeared in his suit pocket during dry cleaning day, dated on an evening he'd claimed to be at a client. Dinner with a group. His phone increasingly turned face down when I entered a room. Olivia's name appeared with growing frequency in his text notifications. Most women might have immediately suspected an affair, but my mind, trained to look beyond immediate assumptions to underlying data patterns, saw something potentially more concerning. The financial inconsistencies weren't random, they were systematic. The Thursday withdrawals, the hotel charges, the unexplained expenses all followed too perfect a pattern. I could have confronted him immediately. I could have checked his phone or followed him one Thursday afternoon. Instead, I approached the situation as I would any potential risk at work, with thorough investigation and comprehensive evidence gathering. The first step was establishing a secure foundation for my investigation. I created a private email account using a VPN connection at the Daily Grind coffee shop across town. I purchased a prepaid phone with cash to maintain secure communications. I established a separate secure cloud storage account for documenting evidence. These weren't the actions of a jealous fiancé, they were the calculated moves of a financial analyst who understood the importance of secure data management. With my infrastructure in place, I began systematically gathering information. I downloaded our complete banking history and credit card statements for the past 18 months. I created a secure backup of all shared digital documents, tax filings, insurance forms, property records. I photographed physical financial records with my personal phone rather than our shared cloud storage. The picture that emerged was both clearer and more complicated than I had anticipated. The inconsistencies in our personal finances were just the surface. Behind them lay a pattern that suggested Jason was operating on multiple financial levels. The visible professional success everyone admired, our personal finances as a couple, and something else. A shadow financial system that seemed designed, specifically to remain hidden. I needed professional expertise beyond my own skills. Reaching out directly to colleagues at Meridian would create too much risk of exposure. Instead, I contacted Marcus Thompson, a forensic accountant I had met at an industry conference the previous year. Our lunch meeting at a restaurant far from financial district haunts was arranged under the pretense of discussing career opportunities. "What you found so far is concerning," Marcus said after reviewing the sanitized version of my data that excluded names and specific identifiers. "But it suggests a pattern that extends beyond personal financial infidelity. These movement patterns, the timing of transfers, the structured amounts just under typical monitoring thresholds, these are classic signs of someone moving money through a system designed to avoid detection." His analysis transformed my understanding of what I was potentially facing. This wasn't just about unexplained hotel charges or dinner receipts. The pattern suggested something more systematic, something that might explain Jason's meteoric rise at Pinnacle despite market conditions that had challenged most financial advisors. "I need to see more," Marcus advised, particularly anything related to his professional activities. The personal accounts often provide only glimpses of larger financial movements. Obtaining information about Jason's professional activities without raising suspicions required careful strategy. One evening, when he mentioned needing to work late on client proposals, I suggested bringing dinner to his office. "You shouldn't have to work on an empty stomach," I said, playing the role of supportive fiancé perfectly. "Plus, I haven't seen your new office since the promotion." Jason hesitated just long enough to notice before agreeing. "That's thoughtful, but things are messy with all the portfolio reviews. How about we meet at Renee's after I wrap up instead?" His reluctance only strengthened my resolve. The next day, when Jason mentioned leaving his presenter remote at home before an important client meeting, I saw my opportunity. "I'll drop it off at your office," I offered immediately. I'm meeting Sophia for coffee nearby anyway. Before he could object, I added, I'll just leave it with your assistant if you're in meetings. This simple act, dropping off a remote that Jason had deliberately left in his desk drawer, provided my first direct access to his professional environment. His assistant, Chelsea, whom I'd met at company events, greeted me warmly. Jason's in back-to-back meetings until 3, but you can leave it on his desk if you want. His office is right through there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 60 seconds I spent alone in Jason's office were enough to photograph his calendar, note the client files visible on his desk, and place a small USB drive in his computer that would allow remote monitoring of activity, a tool my brother, Michael, an IT security specialist, had provided for emergency password recovery after I shared vague concerns about protecting our joint finances. Is everything okay with you two? Michael had asked when I requested his help. This isn't exactly standard pre-wedding planning. Everything's fine, I assured him. Just being careful with our financial information before combining households? Completely. Michael didn't look convinced, but provided the tools I needed with a promise that they would leave no digital footprint and were untraceable. Just promise me you're being careful, Em, he said. Not just with the tech, but with whatever's going on. The data captured through this access revealed what personal financial records could only hint at. Client funds were being temporarily diverted through a complex series of transactions, used for short-term high-risk investments, then returned to their proper accounts before reporting periods, often with minimal gains reported to clients while significant profits were channeled elsewhere. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal, putting clients' financial security at risk while creating the illusion of steady, safe growth. This discovery coincided with another, more personal revelation. The Thursday afternoon patterns aligned perfectly with Olivia's schedule, the only day she worked remotely and was conveniently unavailable for our recurring lunch. The Westbrook Hotel was 3 blocks from her apartment. The weekend Jason claimed to be at a financial conference in New York, his credit card showed charges at a Boston restaurant where Olivia had posted Instagram photos without identifying her companion. I was facing not just financial fraud, but personal betrayal of the most intimate kind. The man I had planned to marry was systematically deceiving his clients, his company, and me. The woman I had included in my wedding party, a symbol of trust and friendship, had betrayed that trust completely. Most people, upon discovering such betrayal, might confront their partner immediately, driven by hurt and anger. But my training in risk assessment had taught me something crucial. Timing is everything. Premature confrontation without complete information and a strategic plan would likely result in denial, evidence destruction, and potentially put me at risk if I was perceived as a threat to Jason's carefully constructed world. Instead, I expanded my investigation, documenting everything with meticulous precision. I consulted with Sophia Martinez, my friend and a corporate attorney, sharing enough information to establish legal protection without revealing the full scope of what I had discovered. What you're describing isn't just grounds for ending a relationship, Sophia advised during a confidential meeting at her office. It potentially involves criminal activity. You need to protect yourself legally before anything else. With Sophia's guidance, I discreetly separated my finances from any connection to Jason's activities. I removed my name from joint accounts, secured my personal documents, and prepared for what would inevitably be a messy separation. But ending the engagement privately wasn't enough, not with what I had discovered about his professional activities. Clients' life savings were at risk. Retirement funds, college savings accounts, elderly investors' fixed income sources, all were being manipulated in Jason's scheme. The ethical financial analyst in me couldn't allow that to continue, regardless of the personal cost. Working. With Marcus and Sophia, I compiled a comprehensive file documenting both the personal deception and the professional fraud. The evidence was irrefutable: transaction records, timeline correlations, documented pattern of fund movements, even recorded conversations where Jason had inadvertently revealed aspects of his methodology while discussing innovative investment strategies with colleagues. 3 weeks before our wedding, with invitations sent and final arrangements confirmed, I faced the decision of how and when to act. The traditional approach would be private confrontation followed by appropriate reporting to regulatory authorities. But something about that approach felt insufficient given the dual betrayal I had experienced. Jason had constructed our relationship on a foundation of lies, while systematically using his professional position to take advantage of people who trusted him. Olivia had pretended friendship while betraying one of the most fundamental bonds, of trust. Both had calculated that I would either never discover their deception or would be too emotionally devastated to respond effectively if I did. They had severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. The rehearsal dinner presented the perfect opportunity, a gathering of the most significant people in our professional and personal lives, including senior partners from Pinnacle, clients who had entrusted Jason with their financial futures, family members who would have become legally connected to his activities through our marriage, and of course, Olivia, seated at the bridesmaid table, pretending to celebrate my happiness. I made my preparations carefully. The slideshow I created for the event included the traditional elements expected: childhood photos, pictures of us as a couple, moments from our engagement. I worked with the restaurant's event coordinator to ensure the technical arrangements were perfect. I secured digital copies of all evidence in multiple locations and provided complete files to both the SEC and the State Financial Regulatory Board, timed for receipt the morning after the rehearsal dinner. The evening began exactly as Jason had planned it: elegant, impressive, a showcase of the successful life he projected. His father's toast emphasized his son's integrity and business acumen. Jason's best man joked about how he'd finally found a woman who appreciated his financial genius. Olivia offered a bridesmaid's toast about the beauty of trusting relationships. When it came time for my comments, I approached the small podium set up near the head table. Jason smiled encouragingly, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady. "A rehearsal dinner is traditionally a time to celebrate the journey two people have taken toward building a life together. It's about honoring the foundation we've built and looking forward to the future we're creating." I paused, making eye contact with Jason, who nodded approvingly. "But that foundation has to be built on something real, on trust, honesty, and genuine commitment to shared values. When I discovered that wasn't the case in our relationship, I had a choice to make." Confusion rippled through the room. Jason's smile faltered. I could walk away quietly, or I could ensure that everyone affected by the deceptions taking place had the information they needed to protect themselves. I pressed the remote in my hand, and the screen behind me changed from a photo of Jason and me to the first slide of my documentation. For the past 4 months, I've been conducting an investigation into inconsistencies I discovered in both our personal and professional finances. What I found was disturbing on multiple levels. The room fell silent as I methodically presented the evidence. The affair with Olivia, documented with times, locations, and financial records. The professional fraud scheme, illustrated with clear examples of how client funds were being misused and manipulated. As a financial analyst specializing in risk assessment, I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. Not just the personal betrayal, but the systematic financial fraud that put so many people's futures at risk. The same skills Jason dismissed as too cautious and lacking vision allowed me to document exactly how he was manipulating both his client's trust and mine. Jason's face had transformed from confusion to anger to something resembling panic as he realized the comprehensiveness of what I was presenting. Olivia stared at her plate, unable to meet the eyes of anyone around her. Pinnacle's senior partner had taken out his phone and was making urgent calls from the corner of the room. To Jason's clients who are here tonight, complete documentation has been provided to the appropriate regulatory authorities, along with contact information for legal representation specializing in investment fraud recovery. To our families, I apologize for the public nature of this revelation, but the scope of deception required a response that would prevent further damage. I turned directly to Jason, meeting his eyes for the first time since beginning my presentation. You believed that my attention to detail, my commitment to thorough analysis, and my ethical standards were limitations, qualities that made me less capable of understanding your sophisticated approach to finance. Those same qualities are what allowed me to identify and document the fraud you thought was invisible. The woman you underestimated is the same woman who has ensured you will be held accountable. The aftermath was both immediate and far-reaching. Jason was placed on administrative leave from Pinnacle the next morning pending investigation. Regulatory authorities froze accounts associated with his investment activities. Olivia resigned from Meridian rather than face her colleagues after. The story inevitably circulated through professional circles. Some questioned my decision to handle the revelation so publicly. My mother worried about the embarrassment to the family. Some friends suggested I should have chosen a more private approach. But those concerns missed the fundamental point: the public nature of the deception, involving not just personal betrayal, but professional fraud affecting dozens of innocent clients, demanded a public accounting. 4 months after the rehearsal dinner that never led to a wedding, I received a job offer from a financial regulatory agency specializing in investment fraud prevention. My experience, both professional and deeply personal, had created a unique perspective on how such schemes operate and the warning signs that often go unnoticed. The analyst skills that Jason had dismissed as limiting became the foundation for work that would help protect others from similar deception. The attention to detail he had characterized as excessive became valued expertise in identifying patterns of potential fraud. The ethical standards he had worked around became guiding principles for an entire department. This isn't just a story about a canceled wedding or exposed infidelity. It's about recognizing that the qualities others might dismiss or undervalue: careful analysis, thorough documentation, ethical boundaries, can become your greatest strengths in moments of crisis. It's about understanding that when someone shows you who they are through inconsistencies between their words and actions, believing the evidence rather than the explanation is not being cynical. It's being honest with yourself. Most importantly, it's about the power that comes from refusing to be underestimated, from using the very skills others dismiss to ensure accountability and protect not just yourself, but everyone else who might be affected by deception. The life I had envisioned. With Jason ended that night at the Harborview restaurant, but something more authentic and ultimately more valuable began. A life built on genuine integrity rather than carefully maintained appearances, on work that creates protection rather than risk, and on the knowledge that the qualities that make us who we are become our greatest assets when facing our greatest challenges. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't walking away silently. It's ensuring that the truth is known, accountability is established, and others are protected from harm. That's not vengeance, it's justice. And sometimes, justice needs witnesses to be truly effective. The days following my dramatic revelation at the rehearsal dinner unfolded in a blur of legal meetings, regulatory interviews, and carefully worded press statements. While the public spectacle had ended that night at the Harborview restaurant, the aftermath was just beginning to ripple through Boston's financial community. Each morning brought new developments: another client coming forward with concerns about their investments, another colleague from Pinnacle reaching out with information they had always found suspicious but never could quite prove, another text from a former friend taking sides in the implosion of what had appeared to be a perfect engagement. I had moved temporarily into Sophia's guest room, unable to face the condo Jason and I had shared. The space held too many memories now tainted by knowledge of his deceptions. The kitchen island where we had planned our future over Sunday morning coffee. The living room where he had rehearsed client presentations while I offered feedback. The bedroom where intimacy had been real for me and apparently performative for him. Sophia's spare room, with its neutral decor and absence of history, provided the blank slate I desperately needed. The SEC investigator called again, Sophia said, handing me a coffee as I reviewed documents at her dining table. 3 days had passed since the rehearsal dinner, and already my carefully organized evidence had become the foundation for multiple investigations. They're impressed with the documentation, said it's one of the most comprehensive cases they've seen from a civilian. Civilian, I repeated, tasting the strangeness of the word. Is that what I am now? A civilian assisting in a financial crimes investigation rather than a bride finalizing wedding details? Sophia sat across from me, her expression softening from professional attorney to concerned friend. You're whatever you choose to be, Em. That's the thing about having your life blown apart. You get to decide how to reassemble the pieces. The philosophical perspective was typical of Sophia, whose pragmatic legal mind somehow coexisted with an almost spiritual belief in finding meaning through adversity. Under different circumstances, I might have found it comforting. In that moment, with the wreckage of my personal and professional life still smoking around me, reassembly seemed an impossibly distant concept. My phone vibrated with an incoming call, Jason's mother. It was the 4th time she had tried to reach me since the rehearsal dinner. Each previous call had gone to voicemail, her messages evolving from confused to defensive to coldly angry. I let this one join the others in the growing collection of conversations I wasn't ready to have. You'll have to talk to some of them. Eventually, Sophia noted, watching me silence the call. Not until I have something to say beyond your son is a fraud in every sense of the word, I replied, returning to the statement I was preparing for the investment firm's internal investigation. Besides, I'm saying everything that matters through official channels now. The doorbell interrupted whatever response Sophia was formulating. She returned moments later with Michael, my brother's expression caught between concern and something that looked uncomfortably like admiration. The proverbial hell has broken loose at Pinnacle, he announced, setting his laptop bag on the table. Their cybersecurity team found our monitoring software during their sweep. Don't worry, he added quickly, seeing my alarm. It's untraceable, designed to self-destruct once removed. But they're conducting a full audit of every system Jason ever touched. Is that going to cause problems for our evidence? I asked, immediately thinking of potential claims about tampering or inadmissibility. Michael shook his head. The opposite, actually. Their internal investigation is uncovering even more than we found. Apparently, Jason had been running versions of this scheme for nearly 5 years, starting with small test cases and gradually expanding as he gained confidence. He paused, studying me with the careful assessment that had always made me feel simultaneously protected and transparent around my older brother. How are you holding up with all this? It was a question everyone had been asking. Sophia, my parents, the few friends I'd spoken with. And I still didn't have an adequate answer. How does one measure holding up when the future you had planned evaporates and is replaced by something unrecognizable? When the person you trusted most is revealed as someone who never actually existed? I'm functional, I finally replied, which seemed the most honest assessment. Focused on making sure the legal aspects are handled properly. And the emotional aspects, Michael pressed, never one to accept technical answers to human questions. I managed a small shrug. Those will have to wait their turn. The compartmentalization wasn't healthy. I knew that intellectually. The emotions would demand their due eventually. But in those early days, keeping the personal betrayal carefully separated from the professional fraud investigation was the only way I could function effectively. One was a matter of broken heart, the other was a matter of broken law. The latter provided clear protocols and processes. The former offered only the messy, non-linear experience of grief. We spent the afternoon reviewing new information Michael had gathered from industry contacts and preparing for my formal interview with the SEC scheduled for the following day. The work provided welcome structure, transforming overwhelming personal chaos into organized professional response. This was familiar territory, analyzing data, identifying patterns, preparing documentation. For a few hours, I could almost forget that the subject of this intensive investigation had been the man I had planned to spend my life with. Almost. The illusion shattered when my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. The message contained only an address in Cambridge and a time, 8 p.m. tonight. A second text followed immediately. "It's Olivia. Please come alone. I have information you need." "Absolutely not," was Sophia's immediate response when I showed her the message. "It's either a trap or a manipulation. Nothing good comes from meeting with her privately." Michael's reaction was even more emphatic. "Have you lost your mind? The woman who is sleeping with your fiancé while pretending to be your friend wants a private meeting? In what universe is that a good idea?" Their concerns were valid. Olivia had demonstrated her capacity for deception repeatedly, maintaining a facade of friendship while betraying one of the most fundamental bonds of trust. Meeting her alone, particularly at an unfamiliar address, carried obvious risks, both emotional and potentially legal if she was attempting to undermine the case against Jason. Yet something about the message suggested desperation rather than calculation. The please seemed particularly telling from a woman whose polished professional persona rarely included vulnerability. And the claim of information I needed triggered the analyst in me who couldn't bear the thought of missing potentially valuable data. "I'll meet her in public," I decided, overriding both their objections. The coffee shop near Harvard Square. Well lit, always crowded, security cameras, and I'll record everything. Neither Michael nor Sophia looked pleased with the compromise, but they recognized the determination that had settled into my decision. It was the same determination that had fueled months of meticulous investigation rather than impulsive confrontation when I first discovered inconsistencies in Jason's stories. "I'm waiting nearby," Michael insisted. "Non-negotiable. You text every 15 minutes or I'm coming in." I agreed to his conditions and arranged the meeting with Olivia. Part of me hoped she wouldn't show, that whatever impulse had prompted, her message would fade when faced with the reality of facing me after everything that had happened. Another part, the analyst who needed complete information before closing any case, hoped she would bring something substantive that would strengthen the investigations already underway. The daily grind was bustling with evening student traffic. When I arrived, securing a table in the corner with clear sightlines to both the entrance and the emergency exit, I positioned my phone on the table, recording app activated, but screen dark. The precautions felt both necessary and surreal. Novel protocols applied to a meeting with a woman who had once helped me choose bridesmaid dresses. Olivia arrived precisely at the rescheduled time, her typically immaculate appearance noticeably diminished. The designer clothes had been replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, her usually perfect makeup minimal, dark circles visible beneath. Her eyes. She scanned the coffee shop with the wary vigilance of someone expecting confrontation from any direction. When she spotted me, her posture shifted, a slight straightening of shoulders as though preparing to face a firing squad. It was so unlike her usual confident stride that I felt a momentary disorientation, as though meeting a stranger wearing the face of someone I had known. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly as she slid into the chair across from me. No greeting, no small talk, an acknowledgement that pleasantries had no place in whatever this conversation would become. "You said you have information I need," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "That's the only reason I'm here." Olivia nodded, her eyes fixing on the table between us rather than meeting my gaze. "I do. But first, I need to say something, even though I know it changes nothing. She took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Emily. What I did was unforgivable. I betrayed your friendship and your trust in the worst possible way. The apology landed hollow in the space between us, accurate in its assessment but meaningless in its impact. Acknowledging the magnitude of betrayal didn't diminish it. If you came to clear your conscience, you've wasted both our time, I said, making a point of checking my watch. Michael would be expecting his first status text soon. I didn't, she replied quickly. That's not why I asked to meet. She reached into her bag and removed a flash drive, placing it on the table between us. This contains communications between Jason and me going back approximately 14 months. Emails, texts, recordings of conversations. Things he said about his investment strategies, about clients, about how he was moving money through the system. I stared at the small device, its potential significance immediately apparent. Private communications could provide context and intent that financial records alone might not capture. The difference between technical violations and demonstrable fraud. Why would you record conversations with him? I asked, suspicion immediately rising. Were you planning this all along? Some kind of insurance policy? Olivia shook her head, a bitter smile briefly crossing her face. Nothing that calculated. I'm in marketing, remember? Recording meetings and conversations is automatic for me. It's how I keep track of client needs and preferences. I never intended to use them against him. She paused. But I never intended to be party to financial fraud either. Yet you were sleeping with him, knowing he was engaged, I pointed out, unable to keep the edge from my voice despite my determination to remain analytical rather than emotional. Yes. She met my eyes directly for the first time. I have no excuse for that part. I convinced myself it was just physical, that it wasn't serious, that it would end before the wedding. The usual rationalizations people use to justify terrible choices. She gestured toward the flash drive. But this isn't about that. This is about ensuring you have everything you need for the investigations. Some of these recordings include Jason discussing specific strategies for moving client funds, using your name as a potential problem if you ever looked too closely at his methods. The mention of my name as a problem sent an involuntary chill through me. I had been focused on the financial deception and the infidelity, but Olivia's statement raised a more disturbing possibility, that Jason had considered me a threat requiring management or elimination if I discovered his activities. What exactly did he say about me being a problem? I asked, my analyst mind immediately assessing potential risk factors I might have overlooked. Olivia hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. It's on the recordings, but he talked about having contingency plans if you ever started asking too many questions, ways to discredit you professionally if necessary, suggesting you were unstable or vindictive if you made accusations. The calculated nature of the contingency planning revealed a level of premeditation I hadn't fully processed before. Jason hadn't just been hiding his activities. He had been actively preparing to destroy my credibility if I discovered them. The personal betrayal suddenly extended beyond emotional infidelity to something approaching psychological warfare. There's more, Olivia continued, her voice lowering despite the ambient noise of the coffee shop. About 3 months ago, he began discussing what he called an exit strategy, liquidating certain accounts, transferring assets to overseas, holdings, establishing residence in countries with limited extradition treaties. I think he knew the risk was increasing as his operations expanded. This information aligned with patterns Marcus had identified in the financial records, increasing movements of personal funds to difficult-to-trace locations, particularly in the past 4 months. What we hadn't known was the intent behind those movements. He was planning to disappear, I said, the implications crystallizing. Possibly before the wedding? Olivia shook her head. After. He was explicit about that timeline. The wedding was important. It established legitimacy and created the appearance of stability. But he had no intention of building the life he described to you. The honeymoon in Italy included meetings with financial contacts there, the first step in establishing his new identity. The scope of the deception expanded with each revelation. The wedding I had been planning wasn't just proceeding despite his affair. It was an instrumental part of a larger strategy, a necessary component in creating the appearance of normalcy, while he prepared to vanish with millions in client funds. "Why are you giving me this now?" I asked, still suspicious of her motives. "You could have come forward at any point during the past 14 months. "Self-preservation," she admitted without hesitation. "After your presentation at the rehearsal, dinner?" I realized I could be implicated as an accessory, especially if there's evidence of me knowing about the financial aspects, which there is. I didn't understand the full scope, but I knew he was operating in gray areas. She gestured to the flash drive again. "This is me choosing a side before the investigators come asking questions I can't answer." Her honesty about self-interest was more convincing than any claim of moral awakening might have been. Olivia was doing what she had always done, assessing the situation and positioning herself advantageously. The difference was that in this instance, her self-interest aligned with my need for comprehensive evidence. "There's one more thing you should know," she said after I had pocketed the flash drive. "Jason has been contacting people, trying to build a counter-narrative about your mental stability, suggesting that you misinterpreted innocent financial transactions because of paranoia and trust issues. He's focusing on your meticulous nature as evidence of obsessive behavior." The strategy was predictable, attacking the credibility of the accuser when the evidence is too strong to dismiss directly. It was exactly what Sophia had warned might happen, why we had been so careful to establish the timeline of discovery and documentation with third-party verification. "That approach won't work with the SEC or regulatory investigators," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The evidence speaks for itself." "It might work socially, though," Olivia pointed out. "With friends, with the professional community. He's very convincing when he positions himself as the victim of misunderstanding." She was right about his persuasive abilities. Jason's success had always been built on his capacity to inspire confidence, to make people feel included in his vision, to create narratives that others eagerly accepted. It was what had made him exceptional at client acquisition, and what had initially attracted me to him. The absolute certainty he projected about our shared future. "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Warning me about his tactics doesn't help your legal position." Olivia was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider her response carefully. "Because despite what you must think of me now, I wasn't faking everything. I did respect you professionally, your attention to detail, your ethical standards, the way you never compromised your analysis even when pressured. And I've seen what Jason can do when he targets someone. It's..." She searched for the word. "Methodical. He identifies vulnerabilities and exploits them systematically." The description echoed my own assessment of how Jason had approached his financial fraud, identifying weaknesses in monitoring systems and exploiting them with calculated precision. The thought that he might apply that same methodology to undermining me personally was unsettling. "I should go," Olivia said, glancing at her watch. "I've given you everything I have. What you do with it is up to you." As she stood to leave, a question that had been circling my mind for months finally surfaced. Was any of it real for him? With me, I mean. Olivia paused, her expression softening with what looked like genuine regret. "I think you were the only real thing in his life. That's what made you dangerous. You expected authenticity he couldn't provide consistently. With me, with clients, with colleagues, he could maintain whatever persona served his purpose. You actually saw him, or tried to. That's why he needed so many contingency plans where you were concerned." It wasn't comfort she offered, but clarity. perspective that transformed the personal rejection implied by his betrayal into something more complex. I hadn't been too blind to see the real Jason. I had seen too clearly for his comfort, necessitating increasingly elaborate deceptions to maintain the facade. After Olivia left, I remained at the table, sending Michael the all-clear text and trying to process the new information. The flash drive in my pocket potentially contained evidence that would strengthen the case against Jason significantly, particularly regarding intent and premeditation. But it also represented a new chapter. In the ongoing unraveling of the relationship I had believed was the foundation of my future, each revelation should have provided closure, another piece of evidence confirming I had made the right choice in exposing Jason's deceptions. Instead, each new detail seemed to expand the damage, revealing additional dimensions of betrayal I hadn't yet processed. The Jason I had known, or thought I had known, was disappearing beneath layers of calculated deception, replaced by someone I couldn't recognize. The next morning, I forwarded Olivia's flash drive to Marcus and Sophia without reviewing its contents personally. The professional part of me recognized the importance of maintaining chain of custody and avoiding any suggestion that I might have altered evidence. The personal part simply couldn't bear to hear Jason's voice discussing me as a problem requiring management, or detailing plans to build a new life that erased our shared history. Smart decision, Sophia confirmed when I called to explain my reasoning. Let the investigators handle the review. Your role in this should be increasingly hands-off now that the official investigations are underway. Her advice made sense from a legal perspective, but creating distance between myself and the investigations proved more challenging than anticipated. The story of the dramatic rehearsal dinner revelation had spread through Boston's financial community with remarkable speed, transforming me from anonymous analyst to central figure in what one financial blog had already dubbed the Pinnacle implosion. Former colleagues reached out with everything from genuine support to thinly veiled requests for insider information on the developing case. Clients I had never met contacted me seeking reassurance about their investments or expressing gratitude for exposing potential threats to their financial security. Most disconcerting were the messages from strangers who had created their own narratives around what had happened, casting me as either avenging heroine or calculating destroyer, depending on their perspective. The actual person at the center of these stories, the analyst who had followed evidence to its logical conclusion, who had acted from professional ethics as much as personal hurt, seemed to disappear beneath projected fantasies of feminine revenge or vindictive overreaction. 1 week after the rehearsal dinner, as these external narratives continued proliferating, I received an unexpected call from Victoria Harmon, the senior partner at Pinnacle Investments who had been present that night. "Ms. Wilson," she began without preamble when I answered, "I wonder if you might be available to meet today. There are aspects of this situation I believe would benefit from direct discussion." The formal tone and careful phrasing suggested legal considerations informing the request. Victoria had built Pinnacle from a small advisory practice into one of Boston's most respected investment firms over 3 decades. "I did respect you professionally, your attention to detail, your ethical standards, the way you never compromised your analysis even when pressured. And I've seen what Jason can do when he targets someone. It's..." She searched for the word. "Methodical. He identifies vulnerabilities and exploits them systematically." The description echoed my own assessment of how Jason had approached his financial fraud, identifying weaknesses in monitoring systems and exploiting them with calculated precision. The thought that he might apply that same methodology to undermining me personally was unsettling. "I should go," Olivia said, glancing at her watch. "I've given you everything I have. What you do with it is up to you." As she stood to leave, a question that had been circling my mind for months finally surfaced. Was any of it real for him? With me, I mean. Olivia paused, her expression softening with what looked like genuine regret. "I think you were the only real thing in his life. That's what made you dangerous. You expected authenticity he couldn't provide consistently. With me, with clients, with colleagues, he could maintain whatever persona served his purpose. You actually saw him, or tried to. That's why he needed so many contingency plans where you were concerned. It wasn't comfort she offered, but clarity. Perspective that transformed the personal rejection implied by his betrayal into something more complex. I hadn't been too blind to see the real Jason. I had seen too clearly for his comfort, necessitating increasingly elaborate deceptions to maintain the facade. After Olivia left, I remained at the table, sending Michael the all-clear text and trying to process the new information. The flash drive in my pocket potentially contained evidence that would strengthen the case against Jason significantly, particularly regarding intent and premeditation. But it also represented a new chapter. In the ongoing unraveling of the relationship I had believed was the foundation of my future, each revelation should have provided closure, another piece of evidence confirming I had made the right choice in exposing Jason's deceptions. Instead, each new detail seemed to expand the damage, revealing additional dimensions of betrayal I hadn't yet processed. The Jason I had known, or thought I had known, was disappearing beneath layers of calculated deception, replaced by someone I couldn't recognize. The next morning, I forwarded Olivia's flash drive to Marcus and Sophia without reviewing its contents personally. The professional part of me recognized the importance of maintaining chain of custody and avoiding any suggestion that I might have altered evidence. The personal part simply couldn't bear to hear Jason's voice discussing me as a problem requiring management, or detailing plans to build a new life that erased our shared history. Smart decision, Sophia confirmed when I called to explain my reasoning. Let the investigators handle the review. Your role in this should be increasingly hands-off now that the official investigations are underway. Her advice made sense from a legal perspective, but creating distance between myself and the investigations proved more challenging than anticipated. The story of the dramatic rehearsal dinner revelation had spread through Boston's financial community with remarkable speed, transforming me from anonymous analyst to central figure in what one financial blog had already dubbed the Pinnacle implosion. Former colleagues reached out with everything from genuine support to thinly veiled requests for insider information on the developing case. Clients I had never met contacted me seeking reassurance about their investments or expressing gratitude for exposing potential threats to their financial security. Most disconcerting were the messages from strangers who had created their own narratives around what had happened, casting me as either avenging heroine or calculating destroyer, depending on their perspective. The actual person at the center of these stories, the analyst who had followed evidence to its logical conclusion, who had acted from professional ethics as much as personal hurt, seemed to disappear beneath projected fantasies of feminine revenge or vindictive overreaction. 1 week after the rehearsal dinner, as these external narratives continued proliferating, I received an unexpected call from Victoria Harmon, the senior partner at Pinnacle Investments who had been present that night. Ms. Wilson, she began without preamble when I answered. I wonder if you might be available to meet today. There are aspects of this situation I believe would benefit from direct discussion. The formal tone and careful phrasing suggested legal considerations informing the request. Victoria had built Pinnacle from a small advisory practice into one of Boston's most respected investment firms over 3 decades. Her reputation for integrity was matched only by her intolerance for anything that might damage the firm's standing. Jason had often mentioned her exacting standards as both aspiration and frustration in his career advancement. I'm available, I replied, curiosity overcoming caution. Though I should mention that my attorney has advised limiting discussions about ongoing investigations. Understood and appropriate, Victoria acknowledged. This conversation would touch on matters adjacent to the investigations, but focused primarily on forward-looking considerations. Would 3 o'clock at the Four Seasons Lobby Lounge be acceptable? Neutral territory with appropriate privacy. The choice of location was telling: public enough to be proper, exclusive enough to limit potential observers, associated with neither Pinnacle nor Meridian. I agreed to the meeting and spent the intervening hours speculating about her intentions. Was this an attempt to gauge what additional information I might have beyond what had been presented at the rehearsal dinner? A prelude to potential civil action to contain damage to Pinnacle's reputation? Or perhaps something more directly personal, given her long-standing mentorship of Jason? The Four Seasons lobby lounge projected exactly the atmosphere Victoria had likely sought: sophisticated but understated, with well-spaced seating arrangements that allowed conversation without broadcasting it to neighboring tables. She was already present when I arrived, her tailored navy suit and perfectly maintained silver bob embodying the old-school investment advisor aesthetic that inspired client confidence. "Ms. Wilson," she greeted me, rising slightly as I approached. "Thank you for making time." "Emily, please," I responded automatically, taking the seat across from her. Professional formality seemed somewhat unnecessary given the circumstances of our last encounter. A ghost of a smile crossed Victoria's face. "Indeed. Though I must say, your presentation that evening reflected remarkable professional composure given the personal dimensions involved." She paused as a server approached, ordering tea with a precision that suggested this was a regular ritual. I requested the same, more to avoid interrupting the flow than from any desire for refreshment. Once the server departed, Victoria's demeanor shifted subtly from professional courtesy to more focused intensity. "I'll be direct, Emily. Pinnacle is facing an existential crisis following the revelations about Jason Carter's activities. The potential legal liabilities are substantial, but the reputational damage could be terminal for a firm built on client trust." This assessment aligned with what financial analysts had been suggesting in industry publications, that regardless of legal outcomes, Pinnacle might not survive the perception that it had failed to detect significant fraud within its senior ranks. "I understand the challenge," I replied carefully, "though I'm not clear on how this concerns me at this point. The investigations will proceed according to regulatory protocols regardless of anything either of us might prefer." Victoria nodded, acknowledging the boundary I had established. "The investigations will indeed follow their course. My interest today involves a different matter." She leaned forward slightly. "Pinnacle needs to demonstrate meaningful change in our compliance and oversight systems, not just to regulators, but to clients and the broader market. We need to rebuild trust through transparent transformation of how we operate." I waited, sensing there was more to this statement than general strategy sharing. "I've spent the past week reviewing your professional background, Emily. Your work in risk assessment and compliance at Meridian has been exceptional, particularly your development of early warning analytics for potential irregularities in advisory accounts. The systems you designed have consistently outperformed industry standards for identifying unusual patterns before they become problematic." The direction of the conversation suddenly became clear, so unexpected that I nearly laughed aloud. "Are you offering me a job, Victoria? At the firm where my almost husband committed systematic fraud?" "I'm offering you an opportunity to transform how an investment firm prevents such fraud from ever happening again," she corrected smoothly. "As Chief Compliance Officer reporting directly to the board, with complete autonomy to redesign our oversight systems from the ground up." The proposal was either brilliant or desperate, depending on one's perspective. Hiring the person who had exposed significant fraud to rebuild compliance systems sent a powerful message about commitment to change. It also created a human interest, narrative that might eventually overshadow the scandal itself, redemption through transformation rather than mere damage control. "The optics are certainly interesting," I acknowledged, "but there are several obvious concerns. The most immediate being that I'm a central witness in multiple investigations involving Pinnacle's operations, which creates appropriate separation until those investigations conclude," Victoria countered. "The position would be held with interim leadership, with you serving as special advisor on restructuring until all legal matters are resolved. Your independence from current systems would be preserved while allowing preliminary work on redesign to begin. She had clearly thought through the sequencing challenges, creating a structure that respected legal boundaries while establishing future direction. It was precisely the type of strategic thinking that had made her successful in navigating complex financial landscapes. There's also the matter of my current employment at Meridian, I noted, though this was largely a formality. My position there had become increasingly uncomfortable as colleagues struggled to interact normally with the woman whose dramatic personal and professional revelations had become financial industry gossip. Meridian's CEO and I have already had preliminary discussions, Victoria replied. They recognize the uniqueness of the situation and would not impede a transition that serves broader industry interests in strengthening compliance standards. The thoroughness of her preparation was impressive. She had anticipated obstacles and addressed them systematically, creating a pathway that appeared both logical and beneficial to all institutional parties involved. The only perspective not yet accounted for was my own emotional readiness to engage with the organization at the center of recent trauma. This is where Jason built his career, I said, giving voice to the most personal objection. Where he developed the relationships and systems that enabled his fraud. I'm not sure I can separate the institution from the individual actions effectively, enough to work there objectively. Victoria considered this for a moment, her expression suggesting this was the first concern she hadn't fully anticipated. That's a legitimate perspective, and one I can't simply dismiss with pragmatic counter-arguments. What I can offer is context that might influence your thinking. She paused as our tea arrived, waiting until the server had departed before continuing. I recruited Jason personally from his previous position. I saw exceptional talent, analytical skill, client rapport, strategic thinking, and believed he could become a cornerstone of Pinnacle's next generation of leadership. I mentored him, advocated for his advancement, introduced him to influential clients. Her voice remained measured, but her hands tightened almost imperceptibly around her teacup. I also missed every warning sign that his ethical framework wasn't aligned with his technical capabilities. The personal admission shifted something in the conversation, transforming it from institutional proposition to human acknowledgement of failure. Victoria hadn't come to recruit an asset for damage control. She had come to connect with someone who might understand both the professional and personal dimensions of betrayal by someone you had invested in. You trusted your judgment, and he exploited that trust, I said, recognizing the parallel to my own experience. Now you're questioning every decision that led to that point. Victoria nodded, a flash of surprise crossing her features at the direct articulation of what had likely been a private struggle. Precisely. 32 years building a firm based on specific principles, identifying and developing talent that embodied those principles, and I completely misjudged someone I worked with daily for nearly 5 years. It's not the same as planning to marry him, I noted, but I understand the sense of fundamental error in assessing someone's character. Different contexts, similar core experience, she agreed, which is partly why I believe you're uniquely qualified for this role. You understand both the technical mechanics of how financial systems can be manipulated and the human factors that allow such manipulation to proceed undetected. The combination is rare and precisely what's needed to create meaningful change, rather than superficial compliance theater. Put in those terms, the proposition took on different dimensions. Beyond career advancement or institutional rehabilitation, it offered something I hadn't considered: the opportunity to transform personal betrayal into systemic improvement that might prevent others from experiencing similar harm. The analyst, who had documented one man's fraud, could potentially redesign systems to identify patterns of deception before they evolved into criminal activity. I need time to consider this, I said finally. The professional opportunity is substantial, but the personal components require more reflection than I can provide in this conversation. Of course, Victoria replied, reaching into her portfolio to retrieve a sealed envelope. This contains the formal proposal, including structural reporting relationships, compensation parameters, and transition protocols. Take whatever time you need to evaluate it properly. She rose to leave, then paused. One additional perspective, if I may. The institutions we build reflect our values only to the extent that we actively embed those values in their operations. Jason's actions don't define Pinnacle's character. Our response to those actions does. As Victoria departed, I remained at the table, the unopened envelope before me representing yet another unexpected turn in a month that had shattered every expectation about my personal and professional trajectory. The proposition was compelling. From multiple perspectives: career advancement, meaningful system reform, potential healing through purposeful action. Yet I couldn't dismiss the visceral hesitation at the thought of walking daily into the building where Jason had developed his deceptions, interacting with colleagues who had worked alongside him, reviewing records that might contain further evidence of his systematic betrayal of client trust. The decision became part of a broader question I had been avoiding since the rehearsal dinner revelation. What did I want my life to look like now that the future I had planned no longer existed? Who was Emily Wilson when not defined as Jason? Carter's fiancé or the woman who had exposed his fraud? The professional opportunity Victoria offered provided one potential answer, but I wasn't yet certain it was the right one. 3 days later, I finally opened the envelope containing Victoria's formal proposal. The terms were even more substantial than her conversation had suggested: complete authority over compliance system redesign, executive-level compensation, board-level reporting structure, and equity participation that would make me a material stakeholder in the firm's future success. The transition timeline was carefully structured to maintain appropriate separation during ongoing investigations while establishing clear authority for future implementation. Beyond the professional components, Victoria had included a personal note acknowledging the unique circumstances of the offer. The truest measure of resilience isn't found in avoiding damage, but in how we rebuild afterward. What Jason attempted to destroy through deception, you have the opportunity to transform through integrity. The choice is entirely yours, with my respect, regardless of your decision. The note captured something essential about the choice before me. Not simply a career decision, but a fundamental statement about how I would allow recent events to shape my future. Would I define my path in opposition to the betrayal I had experienced, or would I integrate that experience into creating systems that reflected my own values and standards? 2 weeks after the rehearsal dinner that had transformed my life's trajectory, I sat across from Sophia and Michael at her dining table, the now familiar setting for our strategy sessions having evolved into something approaching normal routine. The formal proposal from Pinnacle lay open between us, accompanied by notes from my attorney regarding contractual protections and independence guarantees. "It's a remarkable offer," Sophia acknowledged, having reviewed the terms with professional thoroughness. "The reporting structure and authority parameters are exceptional for a compliance position. They're essentially giving you the keys to the kingdom." Which makes sense given the kingdom is currently on fire, Michael noted with characteristic bluntness. The question isn't whether it's a good offer professionally. It clearly is. The question is whether you want to tie your future to the institution where all this happened. Both perspectives were valid, reflecting the tension I had been navigating internally since Victoria's unexpected proposal. The professional opportunity was undeniable, a chance to implement systems that reflected my highest standards, with resources and authority rarely available to compliance professionals. The personal challenge was equally significant, returning daily to the environment connected to recent trauma, potentially triggering continued processing of betrayal rather than supporting healing from it. "There's another aspect we haven't discussed," I said, giving voice to a consideration that had been forming gradually since opening the proposal. "If I don't take this role, someone else will." Someone who likely doesn't understand exactly how Jason manipulated the existing systems, who might implement generic compliance protocols rather than targeted reforms that address the specific vulnerabilities he exploited. Sophia nodded slowly. You're thinking about client protection beyond the immediate situation, about preventing similar schemes in the future. Yes, I confirmed, the decision crystallizing as I articulated it. The analyst in me sees patterns that extend beyond Jason's specific actions, weaknesses in how advisory relationships are structured, how performance is measured, how irregularities are flagged. Those patterns exist throughout the industry, not just at Pinnacle. So you're considering this as a platform for broader reform rather than just institutional repair, Michael observed, his initial skepticism shifting toward thoughtful consideration. Exactly. Pinnacle needs immediate credibility to survive, which creates leverage for implementing changes that might face resistance under normal circumstances. Changes that could eventually become models for industry-wide standards. The more I explained the reasoning, the more certain I became that this was about something larger than my personal history with Jason or Pinnacle. This isn't about reclaiming what was taken. It's about creating something better than what existed before. The decision wasn't just about career trajectory or institutional rehabilitation. It represented a fundamental choice about how I would integrate recent experience into my future identity, not as the woman defined by betrayal, but as the professional whose response to that betrayal created meaningful change. The systems I would build wouldn't erase what had happened, but they might prevent similar harm to others in the future. 1 month after the rehearsal dinner revelation, I accepted Victoria's offer with carefully negotiated terms, ensuring both my independence during ongoing investigations and my authority in implementing comprehensive reforms once legal proceedings reached appropriate resolution. The announcement created predictable waves through Boston's financial community, some lauding it as visionary leadership by Pinnacle, others questioning my judgment in aligning with the firm where such significant fraud had occurred. What few, outside our immediate circle, understood was that the decision wasn't about Pinnacle at all. It was about reclaiming narrative control, choosing to be defined not by what had happened to me, but by what I would create in response. The woman Jason had underestimated, whose analytical skills he had dismissed as excessive caution, would now design systems specifically calibrated to identify the patterns his fraud had followed. The journey from betrayed fiancé to chief compliance officer wasn't a story of neat resolution or simple recovery. It involved ongoing navigation of complex emotions, careful professional boundaries, and the gradual process of separating the institution from the individual who had used it as vehicle for deception. But with each policy redesigned, each monitoring system recalibrated, each training protocol reimagined, I was creating tangible examples of how betrayal could be transformed into protection, not just for myself, but for every client whose financial security depended on systems working as promised. 6 months after the night that had changed everything, I stood before Pinnacle's board presenting the comprehensive compliance redesign that would become the foundation of the firm's second chapter. The system incorporated advanced pattern recognition, algorithms for identifying potential irregularities, transparent client communication protocols, and integrated ethical decision frameworks that extended beyond technical compliance to fundamental principles of fiduciary responsibility. This framework doesn't just address what happened, I concluded, after detailing the implementation timeline. It establishes a new standard for how advisory relationships should function, with transparency, accountability, and verifiable adherence to client interests at every decision point. As board members asked questions about specific components and implementation challenges, I felt a sense of alignment that had been absent in the immediate aftermath of the rehearsal dinner revelation. The skills that had allowed me to document Jason's deception, attention to detail, pattern recognition, commitment to verifiable evidence, were now being applied to creating systems that embodied those same values at institutional scale. The woman who had been betrayed was creating a legacy of protection that would extend far beyond her personal experience. The analyst who had been underestimated was designing standards that would reshape how an entire firm approached its fundamental responsibilities. The transformation wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about ensuring it created positive change rather than merely painful memory. Jason's trial was still pending, the legal proceedings moving at their own measured pace through the system. But my own journey had already progressed to something new, not defined by his actions or their consequences, but by the choices I had made in response. The path forward wasn't about recovering what had been lost, but about creating something that would have been impossible without the catalyst of that loss. Systems designed specifically to identify and prevent the exact patterns of deception I had experienced firsthand. The autumn light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Pinnacle Investment Partners, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany conference table where I sat reviewing the latest compliance audit results. 18 months had passed since the rehearsal dinner that had altered the trajectory of both my personal and professional life. In that time, Pinnacle had undergone a transformation that industry publications were now calling the Wilson Standard, a comprehensive approach to compliance and transparency that was gradually being adopted by other firms seeking to rebuild trust in an industry shaken by high-profile fraud cases. The quarterly reports spread before me showed encouraging trends, early detection systems flagging potential irregularities before they developed into patterns, transparent client communication protocols generating improved satisfaction metrics, and most significantly, a cultural shift within the firm that prioritized ethical considerations alongside performance metrics. The changes hadn't been easy or universally embraced, but the results were becoming increasingly difficult to dispute. "Emily, do you have a moment?" Victoria Harmon's voice pulled me from my analysis. She stood in the doorway, her characteristic, formal posture softened slightly by what appeared to be genuine excitement. "The SEC just published their annual compliance guidance update. You might want to see this." She placed a tablet on the table beside my reports, open to a document that made my breath catch momentarily. There, embedded in the official regulatory guidance for all registered investment advisors, was a detailed recommendation for implementing monitoring systems nearly identical to the framework I had designed for Pinnacle. "They've essentially codified your approach," Victoria noted, her tone reflecting both pride and vindication. "Not as mandatory requirements yet, but as best practices that will likely become standard in future regulatory reviews." I skimmed the document, recognizing specific elements of the monitoring frameworks, communication protocols, and conflict management systems that had been central to Pinnacle's reorganization. The regulatory language was more technical, the implementation, guidance more generalized, but the core principles were unmistakably aligned with what we had built over the past year and a half. "This means every firm in the industry will be measured against standards designed specifically to catch the kind of fraud Jason perpetrated," I said, the significance of this development settling over me. What had begun as a response to personal betrayal had evolved into regulatory guidance that would protect thousands of investors across the country. Victoria nodded, taking the seat across from me. "It's a remarkable achievement, Emily. When I approached you about joining Pinnacle after everything that happened, I believed you could help us rebuild our specific firm. I never anticipated you would end up reshaping compliance standards for the entire industry." The validation was meaningful coming from Victoria, whose decades of experience had initially made her skeptical about some of my more innovative approaches to compliance monitoring. Our early working relationship had been characterized by productive tension, her traditional investment wisdom balancing my more data-driven approach that gradually evolved into mutual respect as implementation results vindicated both perspectives. "The SEC adoption vindicates your decision to support these changes despite considerable internal resistance," I acknowledged, recalling the contentious board meetings where Victoria had consistently backed my recommendations even when they created short-term operational challenges or expense increases. "Change is never comfortable," she replied with the pragmatism that had become familiar during our partnership. "Particularly when it requires acknowledging that previous approaches were insufficient." She paused, studying me with the perceptive assessment that had made her an industry leader. "The question now is, what comes next for you personally? You've accomplished in 18 months what most compliance officers don't achieve in entire careers." The question caught me off guard, though it shouldn't have. The intensive work of redesigning Pinnacle's compliance infrastructure had provided welcome structure during a period of personal rebuilding, the professional challenges offering productive focus while emotional healing proceeded at its own more complicated pace. With the major systems now implemented and beginning to influence industry standards, a natural inflection point had arrived. "I haven't thought much beyond the current implementation phase," I admitted, though the regulatory adoption does suggest an opportunity to expand these standards beyond just Pinnacle. Victoria nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. "Consider that carefully. You've created something exceptional here, and your options for next steps are considerable." She rose to leave, then added, "The Crawford Institute Symposium called again, by the way. They're quite persistent about having you keynote their annual ethics conference." I managed a small smile at the mention of the prestigious financial ethics organization that had been extending increasingly urgent invitations for me to share Pinnacle's transformation story. Public speaking had never been my natural inclination, my analyst's preference for data over narrative making such engagements feel performative rather than substantive. "I'll consider it," I replied, the standard response I'd been giving to similar requests that had multiplied as Pinnacle's approach gained industry attention. Victoria raised an eyebrow, her expression conveying skeptical acceptance of my continued deflection. "The industry needs to hear this story from the person who architected the solution, not just read about it in regulatory guidance, but you'll make that decision when you're ready." After she departed, I returned to the SEC document, examining the specific language that transformed my personal response to betrayal into standardized guidance for an entire industry. The achievement should have felt more satisfying, a concrete validation that the painful dismantling of my personal life had created something of lasting professional value. Yet the moment carried a complexity I hadn't anticipated, a reminder that professional accomplishment and personal healing operated on different timelines with different metrics for completion. My phone buzzed with an incoming message from Sophia. "Dinner tonight? Michael's in town for the conference. 7:30 at Lucia's?" I texted confirmation, grateful for the continued presence of the support system that had been essential during the most challenging periods following the rehearsal dinner. Revelation. While many friendships had complicated or dissolved entirely in the aftermath, people uncomfortable with their proximity to such a public implosion or uncertain how to engage with the new version of Emily that had emerged, Sophia and Michael had remained constant, their support evolving from crisis management to companionship during the gradual reconstruction of normal life. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and deadline-driven projects, the rhythms of corporate life providing the structured predictability that had become an unexpected source of comfort. At precisely 6:45, I gathered my things. To leave, the discipline of maintaining personal boundaries between work and life being one of the hard-earned lessons of recent months. Lucia's was busy when I arrived, the popular Italian restaurant humming with Thursday evening energy. Sophia waved from a corner table where she sat with Michael, both already sipping what appeared to be the restaurant's signature Prosecco cocktails. The familiar sight, my closest confidants in our regular gathering place, triggered a wave of appreciation for the stability they represented in a period otherwise defined by transformation. "The compliance queen arrives," Michael announced as I approached, his teasing tone belied by the genuine affection in his expression. "Should we all sit up straighter now that you're reshaping the regulatory landscape?" The SEC document, I asked, sliding into the seat beside him. News travels fast. Victoria called me, Sophia explained, signaling for a waiter to bring another cocktail. She thought you might downplay the significance and wanted to make sure we properly acknowledged the achievement. The coordination between Victoria and my personal support system might have seemed unusual under different circumstances, but had become a familiar aspect of the carefully maintained balance between professional progress and personal well-being that characterized my post-Jason life. Victoria's understanding of this balance had been an unexpected element of our working relationship. Her recognition that rebuilding Pinnacle's compliance systems and rebuilding my personal foundation were interconnected processes requiring aligned support. It's a meaningful step toward industry-wide implementation, I acknowledged, accepting the cocktail with gratitude. Though there's still considerable work before these standards become universal practice rather than recommended guidance. Always the analyst, focusing on what remains to be accomplished rather than what's been achieved, Michael observed. His gentle critique reflecting both knowledge of my personality and concern about my tendency toward perpetual forward momentum without adequate recognition of progress already made. Fine, I'll be appropriately celebratory, I conceded, raising my glass, to regulatory validation of evidence-based compliance standards. Such a stirring toast, Sophia laughed. No wonder you keep declining those speaking engagements. The conversation shifted to updates about their lives, Michael's expanding cybersecurity consulting practice, Sophia's recent victory in a complex corporate case, mutual friends and shared interests that had nothing to do with investment fraud or regulatory compliance. The normalcy of the exchange was itself a marker of progress. These dinners having evolved from intensive processing sessions focused on legal proceedings and emotional aftermath to genuine friendship gatherings where painful history remained, acknowledged but no longer central. Have you heard anything about the sentencing date? Michael asked as we finished our main courses, the question carefully casual, but touching on the subject that inevitably hovered at the edges of any gathering. November 17th, I replied, the date fixed in my mind despite my determined efforts, to create appropriate distance from the legal proceedings. His attorneys have requested another delay, but the judge seems unlikely to grant it given the previous extensions. Jason's legal case had progressed with the deliberate pace characteristic of complex financial crimes. Initial charges expanded as the investigation uncovered additional victims. Plea negotiations complicated by multi-jurisdictional considerations. Sentencing recommendations debated by prosecutors and defense attorneys seeking vastly different outcomes. Throughout the process, I had maintained the careful balance recommended by legal counsel, providing necessary testimony and evidence while avoiding any actions that might suggest improper influence or excessive personal involvement. Will you attend? Sophia asked, her legal mind always focused on practical considerations. I had been asking myself the same question with increasing frequency as the date approached. Attendance would provide a certain closure, a witness to the formal accountability that would follow the personal reckoning of the rehearsal dinner. It would also mean seeing Jason in person for the first time since that night, a prospect that stirred complicated emotions despite the significant healing that had occurred in the intervening months. I haven't decided, I admitted. Part of me feels it's important to be present for the conclusion of this chapter. Another part questions whether being there serves any constructive purpose, or simply reopens aspects of the experience better left resolved through other means. There's no wrong answer, Michael said, his support characteristically unconditional. Either choice is valid depending on what serves your continued healing rather than his accountability. His sentence will be the same whether you're in that courtroom or running a compliance workshop halfway across the country. The perspective was helpful, reframing the decision around my own well-being rather than any obligation to witness Jason's formal reckoning. It reflected the fundamental shift in my approach to the entire situation, from reactive response to deliberate choice about how each element would influence my ongoing personal and professional development. Speaking of being halfway across the country, Sophia interjected. Has Victoria mentioned the Chicago offer? I shot her a questioning look, surprised by her knowledge of discussions that had only begun preliminarily. How did you hear about that? We just had the initial conversation yesterday. Sophia shrugged, unapologetic about her information sources. Financial services legal circles are smaller than you might think, and a major Midwest investment firm, attempting to recruit the architect of the industry's new compliance standard, generates conversation. Is it something you're considering seriously? The opportunity had emerged unexpectedly. A prominent Chicago-based investment firm seeking to implement Pinnacle's compliance framework, offering a substantial package for me to lead the transition as their chief risk officer. The role represented significant advancement, greater scope, increased compensation, broader institutional influence, but would require relocation and separation from the support system that had been essential during recent rebuilding. It's preliminary, I hedged, not ready to discuss a potential move I had barely begun processing myself. An interesting opportunity, but one with considerable personal implications beyond the professional advancement. You're worried about leaving the support structure you've established here, Michael observed with characteristic perceptiveness. Starting over in a new city where your personal history isn't known, but your professional reputation precedes you. His assessment was accurate but incomplete. The concern wasn't simply about leaving established support, but about determining whether my healing had progressed sufficiently to thrive in an environment where that history wasn't intimately understood by those around me. The question was whether Emily Wilson had rebuilt enough of her independent identity to step fully into a future defined by her expertise rather than her experience. I'm considering whether the timing aligns with my personal development as well as my professional trajectory, I acknowledged. Whether I'm ready to be known primarily for the systems I've built rather than the circumstances that led to building them. That's already happening, Sophia pointed out gently. The SEC guidance doesn't mention Jason Carter or wedding rehearsal revelations. It references the Wilson Compliance Framework as an evidence-based approach to fraud prevention. Your professional identity has already evolved beyond your personal history for anyone not directly involved in the original situation. The observation carried a truth I had been reluctant to fully recognize: that the intensive work of the past 18 months had not just rebuilt Pinnacle's compliance infrastructure, but had established my independent professional identity, separate from the events that had initially brought me into that role. For most of the financial industry, Emily Wilson was now the compliance innovator whose frameworks were reshaping regulatory standards, not the jilted fiancé who had exposed investment fraud at her own rehearsal dinner. I need to consider it carefully, I said finally. The professional opportunity is compelling, but I want to ensure any decision serves long-term well-being rather than just career advancement or geographic escape. That's the Emily we know and love, Michael said with obvious approval. Thorough analysis before decisive action. The conversation shifted again to lighter topics as dessert arrived, but the questions raised lingered in my mind as we finished the evening and said our goodbyes. The decision about the Chicago position represented something larger than career advancement. It was fundamentally about determining whether I was ready to step fully into a future defined by what I was building rather than what I had lost. The following morning, I arrived at Pinnacle earlier than usual, using the quiet pre-business hours to review the Chicago firm's formal offer that had arrived overnight. The package was even more substantial than initial discussions had suggested. Executive leadership position, equity partnership track, complete authority to implement compliance systems based on the framework I had developed at Pinnacle. Beyond the professional components, they had included thoughtful relocation support, connections to local professional organizations, and other elements designed to facilitate personal transition alongside professional advancement. Victoria appeared in my doorway as I was completing my review. Her timing so precise, I briefly wondered if she had some sixth sense about significant decision points. Chicago sent the formal offer, she noted, not bothering to frame it as a question. Impressive package from what I hear. "You have remarkably good information channels," I observed, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Yes, it's a substantial opportunity. One that would allow implementation of our compliance framework on a larger scale with a firm that hasn't experienced the specific challenges that necessitated our changes here." "Proactive rather than reactive implementation," Victoria nodded, understanding the distinction immediately. "Building from clean foundation rather than rebuilding after structural damage. Professionally, it's a natural next step in expanding industry influence." She paused, studying me with the perceptive assessment that had become familiar. "The personal considerations are equally significant, of course." "I've been weighing those carefully," I acknowledged. "Moving means establishing a new support system, building new personal routines, becoming known in a community where my history isn't common knowledge. Which could be either liberating or isolating depending on your perspective," Victoria observed. "The question is whether you're ready to be defined primarily by your future contributions rather than your past experiences." The framing echoed my own thinking so precisely it momentarily startled me, though I had come to expect such insight from Victoria. Our professional relationship had evolved considerably from its initially cautious beginnings, developing into a mentorship that balanced her decades of industry experience with my innovative approaches to compliance design. "That's exactly the question I've been considering," I confirmed, "along with whether accepting this role represents positive advancement or simply geographic escape from lingering associations." Victoria nodded, her expression reflecting appreciation for the thoroughness of my consideration. "When I recruited you to Pinnacle after the rehearsal dinner revelations, I believed you could transform our compliance approach while rebuilding your professional foundation. What I didn't anticipate was how completely you would reclaim narrative control, transforming a situation that might have defined you into the catalyst for work that now defines industry standards." Her assessment touched something essential about the journey of the past 18 months. The gradual shift from being known for what had happened to me to being recognized for what I had created in response. The Wilson Compliance Framework wasn't just professional achievement. It represented fundamental reclamation of identity and purpose from circumstances that might have diminished both permanently. "The Chicago opportunity represents continuation of that trajectory," Victoria continued, "expanding implementation beyond the specific environment where it originated, demonstrating that the framework stands on its own merits, independent of its originating circumstances." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Though Pinnacle would certainly feel your absence, both professionally and personally." The acknowledgement of personal connection beyond professional contribution was meaningful coming from Victoria, whose carefully maintained boundaries had gradually relaxed over our months of working together. The mentor-protégé relationship had developed unexpected depth, her guidance extending beyond investment governance to the broader navigation of professional advancement as a woman in financial services. "I haven't made any decisions," I assured her. "The opportunity deserves thorough consideration of all implications, not just professional advancement metrics." Victoria nodded, rising to leave. "Consider it carefully, but also remember that your value now extends far beyond addressing what happened here. The work you've done deserves the broadest possible implementation, whether that happens from this office or one in Chicago." At the door, she added, "Whatever you decide, the impact of what you've built here remains your professional legacy at Pinnacle." The conversation with Victoria clarified something I had been circling in my consideration of the Chicago opportunity. The decision wasn't simply about career advancement or geographic relocation. It represented a fundamental statement about identity and narrative ownership. Accepting the role would be explicit declaration that my professional future would be defined by the systems I was building rather than the circumstances that had initiated their creation. That afternoon, I left the office early, drawn to the harbor where I had often walked during the most challenging periods following the rehearsal dinner revelation. The waterfront had become an unexpected sanctuary during those months. The constant movement of boats, the shifting patterns of light on water, the sense of connection to something larger and more enduring than immediate circumstance providing perspective when personal turbulence threatened to overwhelm. As I walked the familiar path along the harbor's edge, I reflected on the transformative journey of the past 18 months. The woman who had stood at the Harbor View restaurant revealing her fiancé's financial fraud and personal betrayal had been operating from a combination of professional ethics and personal survival, exposing deception because the analyst in her couldn't allow it to continue, regardless of the personal cost. That decisive moment had been necessary response to immediate threat rather than deliberate choice about future direction. The months that followed had transformed necessary response into purposeful rebuilding, not just of professional systems, but of personal foundation and identity. The Wilson compliance framework that now bore my name hadn't existed when I accepted Victoria's offer to join Pinnacle. It had emerged through methodical application of analytical skills to systematic vulnerabilities, creating protection mechanisms that extended far beyond my individual experience. The Chicago opportunity represented the next logical extension of that rebuilding. Implementation of those protection mechanisms in environments without direct connection to their originating circumstances. It offered the chance to demonstrate that the systems I had designed weren't just response to specific fraud, but comprehensive approach to financial integrity that could transform industry practices regardless of context. As I rounded the harbor's edge where the city skyline came into full view, I made my decision. The Chicago position wasn't escape from painful history, but advancement of positive creation. It wasn't running from the past, but expanding the future that had emerged from that past's difficult lessons. Most importantly, it represented deliberate choice to be defined primarily by what I was building rather than what I had experienced, professional identity grounded in expertise rather than circumstance. 3 weeks later, I stood before Pinnacle's executive leadership team presenting my formal transition plan. The comprehensive document detailed knowledge transfer protocols, implementation continuity measures, and ongoing consultation arrangements that would ensure the compliance systems I had built continued operating effectively after my departure. The presentation was characteristic of my approach: thorough, data-driven, focused on systemic functionality rather than personal dynamics. The infrastructure is designed to operate independently of any individual manager, I explained, addressing the concern most prominent among institutional leadership. The automated monitoring systems, escalation protocols, and review mechanisms create self-sustaining process that will continue identifying potential irregularities regardless of personnel changes. The questions that followed were primarily technical: clarification about specific implementation timelines, verification of training completeness, confirmation of documentation standards. Victoria guided the discussion with characteristic efficiency, focusing on practical considerations rather than the emotional dimensions that inevitably accompanied significant leadership transitions. When the formal meeting concluded, Victoria asked me to remain behind as the others departed. Once the room had cleared, her professional demeanor softened slightly. "You've created a comprehensive transition framework that addresses every operational concern, exactly what we would expect from the architect of our compliance transformation." "The systems are designed for continuity," I replied. "The monitoring, frameworks, communication protocols, and escalation procedures will continue functioning effectively with proper oversight from the compliance team." Victoria nodded, but her expression suggested she was focused on something beyond operational considerations. "The legacy you're leaving extends far beyond technical systems, Emily. You've transformed how this firm approaches fundamental questions about client trust and fiduciary responsibility. That cultural shift will endure long after specific compliance mechanisms evolve." The acknowledgement touched something deeper than professional validation. Recognition that the work of the past 18 months had created lasting impact beyond measurable metrics or documented procedures. The transformation at Pinnacle hadn't been merely technical implementation, but fundamental reorientation of institutional values and priorities. That cultural foundation was built through collaborative effort, I noted, acknowledging the essential contributions of team members who had gradually shifted from skepticism about enhanced compliance to advocacy for higher standards. The commitment to transparency and accountability extended far beyond my individual influence. True, but catalytic leadership creates conditions for broader transformation, Victoria countered. Your ability to translate personal experience into institutional protection mechanisms provided the essential framework for that cultural evolution. She paused, studying me with the perceptive assessment I had come to expect. Chicago is fortunate to be gaining that catalytic influence, though I suspect your impact there will be fundamentally different, building from clean foundation rather than reconstructing after systemic failure. Her observation captured an essential truth about the next professional chapter. The implementation in Chicago would follow different trajectory precisely because it wouldn't be responding to immediate crisis. The opportunity to build proactive protection rather than reactive reconstruction represented significant evolution in how the Wilson compliance framework would influence industry practices. Different implementation context, same fundamental principles, I agreed. Transparency in client communications, comprehensive monitoring of transaction patterns, ethical decision frameworks integrated with performance metrics. These core elements translate regardless of specific institutional history. Victoria nodded, accepting the technical response while clearly hearing the personal significance beneath it. You're ready for this transition, Emily. Not just professionally, but personally. The woman who joined Pinnacle 18 months ago was seeking to transform betrayal into protection. The compliance expert leaving for Chicago is expanding professional vision that stands entirely on its own merits. The assessment was remarkably aligned with my own reflection during the harbor walk where I had made my decision. The transition wasn't about leaving painful history behind, but about advancing professional identity that had evolved far beyond its originating circumstances. Emily Wilson was no longer defined primarily as the woman who had exposed fraud at her own rehearsal dinner, but as the compliance expert whose frameworks were reshaping industry standards. Speaking of standing on independent merits, Victoria continued, the Crawford Institute called again about that keynote address. I took the liberty of suggesting you might be more receptive now that your transition is formalized. They're quite persistent about having the architect of the Wilson framework address their ethics symposium. The mention of the speaking engagement I had been deflecting for months triggered familiar resistance. My analyst's preference for data over narrative making such public presentations feel unnecessarily performative. Yet something about Victoria's phrasing, referring to me as the architect of the Wilson framework, rather than connecting the opportunity to past experiences, shifted my perspective slightly. I'll consider it more seriously, I conceded, though public speaking has never been my natural medium for communication. The most valuable insights often come from those least interested in the spotlight, Victoria observed. Consider it not performance, but necessary knowledge transfer, helping others understand the principles that make these systems effective beyond their technical specifications. The framing was characteristically perceptive, transforming what I had viewed as personal discomfort into professional responsibility. If the Wilson framework was to achieve its full potential for industry transformation, the underlying principles required articulation beyond technical documentation or regulatory guidance. I'll contact them next week, I agreed, though I make no promises about inspirational delivery or dramatic presentation style. Victoria's smile suggested she found my continued resistance to public speaking roles somewhat amusing. They're not seeking dramatic performance, Emily. They're seeking authentic expertise from the person who transformed personal betrayal into systematic protection. Your analytical approach is precisely what gives your perspective its unique credibility. The weeks that followed passed in carefully orchestrated transition. Knowledge transfer sessions with the compliance team that would maintain Pinnacle's systems, preliminary meetings with Chicago leadership about implementation priorities, practical arrangements for geographic relocation that would begin new professional chapter. Throughout this period, I maintained the structured approach to major change that had become characteristic of my post-Jason life: methodical planning, comprehensive preparation, clear boundaries between professional advancement and personal adjustment. 1 week before my scheduled departure from Boston, the date for Jason's sentencing was finally confirmed after multiple delays. November 17th, 5 days before I would begin officially at the Chicago firm. The timing created obvious, practical consideration about potential schedule conflicts, but also raised the more significant question I had been circling without definitive resolution: whether witnessing the formal conclusion of legal proceedings would serve constructive purpose in my ongoing healing and forward progress. The decision crystallized during a final dinner with Sophia and Michael, who had been providing increasingly focused support as my departure date approached. As our conversation touched on practical aspects of the move and professional dimensions of the new position, Michael asked the question directly: "Have you decided about the sentencing hearing? It's the same week as your move, right?" I nodded, having already considered the logistical implications. November 17th, 3 days before I leave for Chicago. "Will you attend?" Sophia asked, her directness reflecting both legal mind's focus on closure and friends' concern about emotional impact. The question had been circling in my consideration for weeks, balanced between desire for formal conclusion and concern about reopening aspects of experience better left resolved through other means. The proximity to my departure date added additional dimension, whether carrying that particular interaction into new beginning served constructive purpose. "No," I said finally, the decision settling into place with surprising clarity. "I've provided all necessary testimony and evidence for legal proceedings. My presence at sentencing doesn't affect the outcome or serve any substantive purpose in the judicial process." "Are you concerned about the emotional impact of seeing him again?" Sophia asked, her question reflecting genuine curiosity rather than challenge to my decision. I considered this carefully, wanting my response to reflect authentic assessment rather than defensive justification. "It's not about avoiding emotional response," I said finally. "It's about recognizing that my healing and forward progress aren't connected to witnessing his formal accountability." That chapter concluded for me at the rehearsal dinner when I reclaimed narrative control by exposing the fraud. The legal consequences that follow are necessary for systemic justice but not essential for my personal closure. Michael nodded, his expression suggesting he found this reasoning both sound and healthy. "Your story with Jason ended the night you chose truth over. Maintain deception. Everything since has been about what you're building rather than what he destroyed." The framing captured something essential about my journey since the rehearsal dinner revelation: the gradual transformation from reactive response to deliberate creation, from necessary exposure of fraud to purposeful building of protection systems. The Wilson compliance framework that now bore my name represented fundamental reclamation of professional identity and purpose that extended far beyond response to betrayal. "Exactly," I confirmed. "Attending the sentencing keeps me tethered to narrative where I'm defined primarily by what happened to me rather than what I've created since. That's not the energy I want to carry into this new chapter in Chicago." Sophia studied me for a moment, her legal mind obviously processing this reasoning against considerations of formal closure. "That's surprisingly healthy perspective," she concluded finally. "Most people would feel compelled to witness that final moment of accountability, even if it served no constructive purpose in their healing." "I'm not most people," I reminded her with a small smile. "I'm an analyst who prefers data-driven decisions about personal healing as well as professional advancement." The decision about Jason's sentencing hearing represented something larger than schedule management during transition period. It was a fundamental statement about narrative ownership and identity formation. By choosing not to attend, I was explicitly declaring that my story had evolved beyond response to betrayal into creation of systems that would protect others from similar harm. Emily Wilson was no longer defined primarily by what had happened 18 months ago at the Harbor View restaurant, but by the compliance framework that now influenced regulatory standards across the financial industry. 2 days before my scheduled departure for Chicago, I completed final walkthrough of the compliance systems at Pinnacle with the team that would maintain them after my transition. The comprehensive review covered monitoring protocols, escalation procedures, communication standards, and documentation requirements, all the technical elements that comprised the Wilson framework in its operational form. As the session concluded, I addressed the team directly. These systems don't require my specific presence to function effectively. They're designed for operational independence with appropriate oversight from qualified professionals, exactly what each of you provides. The effectiveness of this framework depends on the principles being consistently applied, not on the presence of any individual architect. The statement was intended as professional reassurance during leadership transition, but carried personal significance that extended beyond immediate context. The protection mechanisms I had designed weren't dependent on my individual experience or perspective. They functioned based on principles of transparency, verification, and accountability that transcended any specific implementation environment. That evening, as I finished packing my apartment for the move to Chicago, my phone alerted with breaking news notification: investment advisor Jason Carter sentenced to 12 years for fraud scheme. The headline was accompanied by courthouse photograph showing Jason being led away in handcuffs, his expression unreadable behind carefully maintained composure. I studied the image briefly, struck by the emotional distance I felt viewing it. The man being escorted by federal marshals seemed disconnected from both the charming investment advisor I had agreed to marry and the calculated deceiver I had exposed at our rehearsal dinner. He had become almost abstract representation of financial fraud rather than intimately known individual, case study and betrayal of trust rather than personal connection. My phone buzzed with incoming message from Sophia. Saw the news. You okay? Her concern was understandable given the timing and potential emotional impact. I considered my response carefully, wanting to provide accurate assessment rather than reflexive reassurance. After brief reflection, I replied with simple truth. Yes, feels appropriately distant. Confirmation of decision not to attend. Her response came quickly. That's remarkably healthy. Most people wouldn't have achieved that perspective in 18 months. The observation echoed similar comments she had made during our final dinner, reflecting genuine surprise at the extent of healing and forward progress that had occurred since the rehearsal dinner revelation. What neither Sophia nor others fully understood was that the healing hadn't been abstract emotional process, but concrete professional creation. The development of the Wilson compliance framework, providing structured pathway for transforming betrayal into protection. Each monitoring protocol designed to identify unusual transaction patterns, each communication standard established to ensure transparent client relationships, each verification procedure implemented to prevent unauthorized account access, all had served dual purpose as both professional enhancement and personal reclamation. The systems I had built to protect others had simultaneously rebuilt my own foundation, creating pathway from betrayal to meaning that transcended conventional recovery narratives. 2 days later, I boarded the flight to Chicago, leaving Boston and its associated history physically behind, while carrying forward the professional identity and expertise that had emerged from that history's difficult lessons. As the plane lifted, through cloud cover into clear blue sky above, I reflected on the transformative journey that had begun 18 months earlier at the Harbor View restaurant. The woman who had stood before assembled guests revealing her fiancé's fraud had been operating from combined imperative of professional ethics and personal survival, exposing deception because the analyst in her couldn't allow it to continue, regardless of personal cost. That decisive moment had been necessary response to immediate threat rather than deliberate choice about future direction. The compliance expert, now heading to executive leadership position in Chicago, represented fundamental transformation of that initial response into purposeful creation that extended far beyond individual experience. The Wilson framework wasn't just professional achievement. It was tangible demonstration that betrayal could be transformed into protection, that personal trauma could generate systemic improvement, that individual harm could inspire institutional healing. As Boston disappeared beneath the clouds, I opened my laptop to review notes for my upcoming presentation at the Crawford Institute's Ethics Symposium. After months of deflecting their invitations, I had finally agreed to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference. Not to share a personal story of betrayal and revenge, but to articulate the principles that made the Wilson framework effective in preventing financial fraud across institutional contexts. The preliminary slides reflected my analytical approach, data-driven assessment of vulnerability patterns, evidence-based monitoring protocols, quantifiable metrics for measuring effectiveness. Yet Victoria's parting advice about the presentation had encouraged including something beyond technical specifications. Help them understand not just how these systems work, but why they matter, the human impact of financial deception, and the protection these frameworks provide. Following her guidance, I had added concluding section addressing the fundamental purpose behind technical implementation, ensuring that trust placed in financial advisors was anchored in verifiable practices rather than personal charisma, that client protection was structured into operational systems rather than dependent on individual ethics, that transparency was standard procedure rather than exceptional practice. The final slide contained the core message I wanted industry leaders to understand. Effective compliance isn't about restricting business practices or imposing bureaucratic barriers. It's about creating systems where trust is continually earned through verifiable actions rather than assumed through professional titles. It's about recognizing that protecting clients from potential harm is the foundation upon which sustainable financial relationships are built. This message, focused on principles rather than personal experience, represented the essential transformation of my professional identity over the past 18 months. Emily Wilson was no longer defined primarily as the woman who had exposed fraud at her own rehearsal dinner, but as the compliance expert whose frameworks were reshaping how an entire industry approached questions of trust, verification, and accountability. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, I closed the presentation and gazed out at the endless horizon stretching before me. The journey that had begun with betrayal had evolved into creation of protection systems that would influence financial practices far beyond my individual experience. The analyst skills that Jason had dismissed as excessive caution had become the foundation for industry-wide standards that would prevent similar deception from harming others. The Chicago opportunity represented not escape from painful history, but advancement of professional vision that had emerged from that history's difficult lessons. Emily Wilson was moving forward, not despite what had happened 18 months ago, but because of how she had transformed that experience into expertise that now defined her on her own terms. The betrayal that might have diminished had instead become catalyst for creation. The fraud that might have destroyed had instead inspired protection. The relationship that had ended in deception had ultimately generated systems of transparency that would extend far beyond any individual connection. As the journey to Chicago continued, I reflected on the most significant lesson of the past 18 months, that reclaiming narrative control doesn't require erasing painful chapters, but transforming them into foundation for creating something meaningful that extends beyond personal experience. The Wilson Compliance Framework wasn't denial or erasure of betrayal, but purposeful transformation of that betrayal into protection, not just for myself, but for countless others who would never know the specific circumstances that inspired its creation. In that transformation lay the most powerful response to betrayal. Not mere survival or recovery, but creation of lasting change that ensures similar harm doesn't befall others. The analyst who had been underestimated had not just exposed fraud, but designed systems to prevent its recurrence. The woman whose trust had been betrayed had not just survived that betrayal, but created frameworks of verification that would protect others from similar deception. The Crawford Institute's annual Ethics in Financial Services Symposium filled the grand ballroom of Chicago's Lakeside Hotel with a sea of tailored suits and polished name badges. As I stood in the wings waiting for my introduction, I observed the assembled financial elite with analytical detachment: CEOs, compliance officers, regulatory officials, and industry thought leaders gathered to discuss ethical frameworks that too often remained theoretical rather than operational in daily practice. And now, delivering our keynote address on Trust as Verifiable Practice, the Future of Financial Compliance, please welcome Emily Wilson, Chief Risk Officer of Meridian Capital Group and architect of the Wilson Compliance Framework. The applause that greeted my entrance carried a different quality than the typical conference reception, more substantive interest than perfunctory acknowledgement, reflecting awareness that the framework bearing my name was rapidly becoming the industry's new operational standard. As I took my place at the podium, I activated the presentation I had refined during my first 3 months in Chicago, designed to translate technical compliance systems into principles that resonated beyond regulatory requirements. When we discuss financial compliance, I began, we often frame it in terms of regulations to be followed, requirements to be met, boxes to be checked. This approach misses the fundamental purpose behind these systems. Effective compliance isn't about avoiding penalties. It's about creating environments where trust is continuously earned through verifiable actions, rather than assumed through professional titles or institutional reputations. The room's attention sharpened, the subtle shift in posture and expression suggesting recognition that this wouldn't be another technical presentation on implementation protocols. Financial executives were accustomed to compliance discussions, focused on minimum requirements and implementation costs. The framing of compliance as proactive trust building represented perspective that challenged industry assumptions about regulatory relationships. For the next 40 minutes, I walked the audience through practical applications of these principles, illustrating how technical monitoring systems, communication protocols, and decision frameworks created environments where deception became increasingly difficult to execute and increasingly likely to be detected before causing significant harm. As I approached the conclusion, I shifted from technical specifications to broader purpose. The systems we've discussed aren't just about preventing financial malfeasance or meeting regulatory requirements. They're about recognizing that clients entrust us with their financial security, their retirement plans, their children's education, funds, their life savings. That trust deserves protection structured into our operational DNA rather than promised through marketing language. The connection between technical systems and human impact appeared to resonate with the audience, particularly among senior executives, whose focus typically remained on performance metrics rather than protection mechanisms. The shift in perspective, from viewing compliance as cost center to understanding it as trust foundation, represented the essential transformation the Wilson framework was designed to create within institutional culture. Following my presentation, I found myself surrounded by attendees with follow-up questions and implementation inquiries. Catherine Reynolds, CEO of Atlantic Financial Partners, approached with purposeful stride. "That was remarkably compelling," she observed, extending her hand. "Atlantic Financial would be interested in discussing potential implementation of your framework. We've been watching the results at Meridian with considerable interest." The expression of interest from one of the industry's most established firms represented significant validation. Atlantic Financial was known for a conservative approach to operational changes, implementing new systems only after thorough evidence of effectiveness. Later that evening, I received an unexpected call from Victoria Harmon, my former mentor at Pinnacle, whose guidance had been instrumental during initial development of the compliance framework. "I hear the keynote was exceptional," she began, without preamble. Multiple executives from Atlantic Financial contacted me today with implementation inquiries. Apparently, the Wilson framework is becoming essential standard rather than optional enhancement. The reception was encouraging, I acknowledged. The technical focus seems to be resonating across different types of institutions, verification and transparency principles transcending specific organizational contexts. The framework was never about specific fraud response, but fundamental. Protection principles applicable across financial services, Victoria noted. That's why it's generating implementation interest from firms without fraud history, prevention rather than reaction driving adoption decisions. Victoria paused, her tone shifting to something more personal. The question now becomes what Emily Wilson's life includes beyond professional identity reclaimed from difficult circumstance. What constitutes flourishing rather than merely functioning, exceptionally in career context? The distinction resonated deeply. Flourishing versus functioning, integrated life development versus singular professional focus. The intensive work of the past 2 years had necessarily concentrated on reclaiming professional identity and purpose following devastation. The next phase could expand into broader life dimensions without diminishing that professional contribution. 3 days later, during Meridian's executive committee meeting, where Implementation Consulting Division was formally proposed, I offered balanced perspective that reflected this evolving understanding. The consulting division represents valuable opportunity for expanding framework adoption across multiple institutions. I propose hybrid leadership model that allows strategic direction while delegating implementation management to team structure that ensures continuity without requiring constant personal involvement from framework architect. Robert Chen, Meridian's CEO, nodded approvingly. The hybrid model aligns with our understanding of sustainable leadership. The framework's continued expansion doesn't require sacrifice of broader life development from its architect. That evening, I received a message from Robert suggesting involvement with Chicago Children's Financial Education Initiative, an opportunity to extend protection principles beyond corporate implementation into educational foundation that might prevent future harm rather than just addressing current vulnerabilities. As Chicago's evening lights illuminated the urban landscape before me, I reflected on the distinct evolution from 2 years earlier. The Wilson framework that bore my name wasn't denial or erasure of painful history, but purposeful transformation of that history into protection systems that continued expanding beyond my direct involvement. The analytical skills that had documented Jason's deception were now being applied across multiple financial sectors to identify similar patterns before they caused significant harm. Most significantly, the identity I had reclaimed from betrayal wasn't defined primarily by that experience, but by the protection systems created in response. Professional contribution that stood entirely on its own merits, independent of originating circumstances. Emily Wilson wasn't the woman who had exposed fraud at her rehearsal dinner, but the compliance expert whose frameworks were reshaping how an entire industry approached questions of trust, verification, and accountability. That transformation represented most powerful response to betrayal. Not mere survival or recovery, but creation of lasting change that continued protecting others from similar harm long after the initial betrayal had faded from active memory. The framework's expanding influence across financial sectors ensured that Jason's betrayal hadn't diminished my life, but had ultimately expanded my impact far beyond what would have been possible in the future we had planned together. As night settled over Chicago's dynamic skyline, I recognized that the next chapter would balance that professional impact with broader life development, relationships beyond work connections, community engagement beyond corporate implementation, personal pursuits beyond career advancement. The foundation established through professional reconstruction created stability for this expanded flourishing. Identity secured through meaningful contribution rather than dependent on another's validation. In that transformation lay the essence of resilience, not merely surviving difficult experience, but creating meaningful response that extends beyond individual healing into lasting contribution. The analyst who had documented betrayal had not just exposed fraud, but designed systems to prevent its recurrence across an entire industry. The woman whose trust had been violated had not just recovered from that violation, but created frameworks of verification that would protect others from similar deception. That lasting contribution represented justice more meaningful than any court sentence. Transformation of betrayal into protection that extended beyond individual experience to systemic improvement. Emily Wilson had not just survived betrayal, but created response that continued protecting others from similar harm. Identity defined not by what had been taken, but by what had been built in its place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.